Okay, so welcome everyone to our debate for week 15. We will be discussing experimental functional analysis versus analog functional behavior assessment. Before we begin, let me introduce those who will be participating in our debate. My name is Brittany, and I will be the introducer to this debate as well as concluding the debate. Cassandra is our researcher. She will be discussing the research articles that support each type of assessment. Jennifer will be describing the pros and cons of each type of assessment. Jessica is our illustrator, and she will be providing visuals to help identify the pros and cons of each type of assessment. And Kayla will be providing information on common questions asked about each assessment, as well as answer any new questions that arise. To begin our debate, let me introduce each type of assessment. First, we have experimental analysis. This can also be referred to as an FA. Functional analysis is completed through manipulation of antecedents and consequences of a target behavior in order to identify the behavior. This type of assessment is most often completed in a clinical setting, allowing for the manipulation of the setting. Next, we have analog functional behavior assessment. This can also be referred to as FBA. FBA is completed through observation in order to identify the function of the behavior. This can be completed through direct observation, such as observing the client in active setting, or indirect observation, such as interviewing those who have worked with the client. We will now begin with Jennifer, who will identify the pros of an FA.
The biggest pro of a functional assessment, or FA, includes the ability and ease of proving that a specific variable is causing the behavior to occur. After each pro and con is discussed, Cassandra will provide the research that supports all of our pros and cons for both functional analysis, or FAs, and analog functional behavior assessments, FBAs. Kayla will also be providing information on common questions about each assessment.
So in the article, Functional Analysis, a Need for Clinical Decision Support Tools to Weigh the Risks and Benefits, the authors discuss how a behavior analyst or other qualified individual is able to test different events to get an idea of the circumstances that a specific behavior might occur in. Once the behavior analyst observes the behavior, they can then narrow down what is causing as well as maintaining that behavior. In the article, Comparing Indirect, Descriptive, and Experimental Functional Assessments of Challenging Behavior in Children with Autism, the authors studied and compared the results between 3 types of assessments. They found that the indirect and experimental assessments had the same conclusions for 3 of the 7 clients. The authors also found that the experimental assessment, as well as the indirect, provided decisive results for each of the 7 individuals. This information suggests within this study that experimental assessments could be potentially more consistent than descriptive assessments.
Another pro of a functional assessment is that the observer is able to physically see the function of the behavior as opposed to being told the information from a parent or a teacher. This allows the FA to be more accurate from the point of view of the observer.
The article I previously mentioned also discusses this type of analysis, serving as the gold standard. Not only is the behavior analyst able to uncover the variables surrounding a behavior, they're also able to do this firsthand and have proof of the events leading up to and maintaining the behavior. In addition to this, an experimental functional analysis may shorten the evaluation time needed.
To summarize Jennifer's and Cassandra's information, functional assessments are beneficial because they're able to effectively identify why a behavior is occurring. They also use measures so that BCBAs do not need to solely rely on indirect assessments for their information. Next, we will discuss pros of FBA.
There are several pros of the analog functional behavior assessments, or FBAs. The first is that an FBA can be completed in several steps, which makes this assessment more reliable without having to increase or reinforce the undesired behavior.
The article Overview of Functional Behavior Assessment Processes by George Sugai, Terry Lewis Palmer, and Shauna Hagen-Burke lists a total of 8 steps for an FBA process. These steps include collecting information, developing a summary statement, collecting direct observation data to confirm the summary statement, developing a competing pathways summary statement, developing behavior support plan, and developing details and routines for full implementation of behavior support plans, as well as monitoring and evaluating implementation of the behavior support plan. These overview each section of the process, and as you can tell, the many necessary steps.
Another pro of the FBA is that it can be set up as either open-ended or structured, whichever is most comfortable for both the family and the clinician. A more open-ended FBA could include questions such as, which behavior is most important to your family to target first? And also gaining an idea of what each behavior looks like to the family. For instance, what does physical aggression look like? A more structured FBA will include a QABF, which stands for Questions About Behavioral Function, to determine the function of the behavior by asking questions that can be answered as never, rarely, sometimes, or often. There are 25 questions in this particular assessment, but sample questions include, does the client engage in the behavior when asked to do something? And does the client engage in the behavior and seem to be saying, leave me alone?
An article titled Comparing Indirect, Descriptive, and Experimental Functional Assessments of Challenging Behavior in Children with Autism discusses ABC assessments as another option. These assessments can be performed in an open-ended format by discussing the traits of the antecedents and consequences, or in the more structured format, such as classifying the antecedents and consequences into categories that may or may not overlap.
The last pro of the FBA is how it allows for natural environment observation. This allows the observer to record several possible variables. Observation also permits for seeing how the family unintentionally reinforces the behavior and how that they can correct that in the future.
The article Evaluation of the Treatment Utility of Analog Functional Analysis and Structured Descriptive Assessment by Carrie English, Cynthia Anderson, discusses Jennifer's pro and notes that these types of assessments are frequently conducted in more naturalistic environments versus a laboratory setting. Because of this difference, the data is taken on more naturally occurring behaviors and can thus be more reliable for the treatment plan. This form of observation also allows the observer to see the circumstances surrounding natural reinforcement because of the setting of the environment.
As Jennifer and Cassandra mentioned, there are many pros to using FBAs. These include observing the client in their typical environment to get an idea of how that environment may be affecting the behavior. Also, the assessment is completed over several steps, making the assessment more reliable without trying to manipulate the function of the behavior. As we have seen, there are both FBAs and FAs. FBAs allow FBAs to gain more natural information regarding the function of the behavior, and FAs to work with possible functions of the behavior in order to identify the function of the behavior. Ethical Code 3.01a states that BCBAs must use current assessments prior to beginning the behavior change program. Part of that is whether an FBA or FA should be used. Next, we're going to look at the cons of using each type of assessment.
The biggest con of the functional assessment or an FA is that the observer is reinforcing the undesirable or targeted behavior. For example, we assisted in running an FA with a client whose targeted behavior was aggression and the function was access to tangible items. He enjoyed woodworking but had difficulty accepting unknown things that could happen, such as his project breaking or not having the correct tool. We set up multiple examples of projects that would break as soon as he would touch them, or making him use the incorrect tool, for example, a screwdriver instead of a hammer, to instigate these physical outbursts. If and when he would begin to engage in the physical aggression, we allowed him immediate access to the correct tool or an identical project that is not going to break apart.
Because the functional analysis is based on experimenting and controlling various variables, including antecedents and consequences, some unwanted behaviors may be temporarily reinforced to prove or disprove the hypothesized variables. This was discussed in the article by Carrie L. English and Cynthia M. Anderson.
Another con is that the parental consent may be needed and a risk assessment in that case should be completed in order to identify if the FA assessment outweighs the potential harm. This would fall under section 3.03 of the BCBA ethical codes.
Jennifer's last con was also discussed in the article, Functional analysis, a need for clinical decision support tools to weigh risks and benefits. Some behaviors may be more serious and dangerous to the individuals or others within the environment. It is our responsibility to always weigh the risks and minimize them. In this case, for example, it would be important to do a risk assessment to evaluate if the harm that could come from the FA would be greater than the value of information that may come from conducting the analysis. The article discusses that there are several factors such as distinguished data patterns, data available for the presence and absence of the behavior, and few failed treatments. All of these may indicate that a descriptive assessment may be the route to take instead of an FA.
Some practitioners may feel uncomfortable completing an FA, even if the benefits outweigh the risks, simply due to the lack of a formal evaluation. Elaborating further off of the example of the FA I was able to be a part of, there were parts that made me feel uncomfortable while the analysis was being completed, such as when my client's projects would break every time he would touch them. We, of course, received parental consent, and the dad was the person who broke all the projects due to us stating we didn't want to break our client's belongings. There needs to be a specified direction for the FA, especially if the targeted behavior is physical aggression.
In the last article I mentioned, the authors point out that the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts states that a risk assessment must be completed. However, the code does not specify how to do this assessment. Several aspects must be considered when performing the assessment, and with a lack of direction, as well as the possible severity of some behaviors, newer behavior analysts have the potential to neglect potentially important factors that could impact the risk assessment.
A functional analysis tend to be the less preferred method for BCBAs due to risk factors that may need to be accounted for. Since an FA manipulates behaviors, BCBAs run the risk of reinforcing the undesired behavior. Also, prior to using an FA, a risk assessment should be completed to identify if the use of the FA outweighs the risk of harm that could be caused through manipulation of behaviors. Finally, this is a less preferred method because BCBAs do not have enough informal training to comfortably complete the risk assessment. Now we will discuss the cons of using an FBA.
Perhaps the biggest con of the FBA is simply the length of time it takes to complete. Usually, FBAs take multiple sessions, but can also take upwards of a few weeks before an observer can begin collecting baseline data based on availability of the family and the BCBA.
As discussed in the article, Overview of Functional Behavioral Assessment Processes by George Sagai, Terry Lewis Palmer, and Shauna Hagen-Burke, there are two tiers in an FBA. The first is less formal and consists of short interviews, casual observations, and reviewing of past reports. The more extensive option may be used when there is some disagreement on the information obtained from an informal FBA. The second form of FBA is more in-depth and may have several observations occurring across environments to collect the data on occurrences of behavior. It may include multiple formal interviews and have a more detailed account of the client's history, such as treatments that were or were not effective in the past. The article also states that observations need to take place in a variety of settings, as well as vary in the day of the week, time of observation, and the events. Data for the undesirable behavior, as well as ABC data and the impact of setting events, should also be included. Information of this extent would take time to collect.
Along with the length of time before an observer can begin collecting data, there is a possibility for the behavior to not occur during the designated observation period. This would continue to extend the observation window since we can only provide interventions for what we see.
This scenario is also mentioned in the article by English and Anderson. The extent to which behaviors are environmentally affected, as well as a lack of behavior occurring during the observation, can make the forming of a hypothesis problematic. When this occurs, further and possibly a more in-depth observation may be necessary.
Depending on the observer, or if there is more than one observer, the ABC and baseline data could be recorded inaccurately. In regard to inaccuracy, the information provided by the family could also be flawed. Until the observation period occurs, that would be unknown to the clinician.
Comparing indirect, descriptive, and experimental functional assessment of challenging behavior in children and autism. Article points out that individuals may need to be well-trained and have experience in the collecting of ABC data to ensure that events leading up to, called antecedents, as well as the outcomes, which are called consequences, are recorded fully and accurately to be helpful to the analyst. Many times, parents are not trained in this area and may not come to the same conclusions regarding this information as a trained professional would.
Once the observation period is complete, coaching needs to be provided for the family. If the BCBA is not the constant interventionist in the home, then the professionals who will be providing that coaching need to be in attendance of the observation days and have designated training in that area to provide the best care for the client.
In the article, Overview of the Functional Behavioral Assessment Process, the authors review one of the steps of an FBA, which is the development of details and routines for full implementation of the behavior support plan. This section discusses the need for the client's team to develop all the materials, definitions for the behaviors, and the procedures for how to implement the plan, as well as training for those who will be implementing said plan.
The main cons for using an FBA is the amount of time that is required to complete the observation, as well as the training that must take place if the BCBA is not the main provider of the behavior change intervention. FBAs could take weeks to complete, and there's a possibility that the behavior in concern may not occur during the observation period, which would set the observation period back. Finally, if the FBA is not providing the behavior change intervention, they may need to spend extended time training teachers, parents, and more how to properly implement the intervention.
This chart is from the article that Cassandra mentioned, comparing indirect, descriptive, and experimental functional assessments of challenging behavior in children with autism by Turbo et al. It shows the differences in results that come from each type of assessment. The indirect and descriptive are both behavior assessments, or FBAs. The experimental is a functional analysis, or FA. As you can see, they all come up with similar functions. However, specific assessments or analyses are able to determine a single function for different clients or behaviors, or to look at it from a different angle, different clients or behaviors benefit from more specific assessments. This is why some behaviors will use more than one assessment or analysis before determining a function.
I will now be going into questions. Brittany, an FA is completed through manipulating antecedents, which happen before the behavior, and consequences which happen after the target behavior, in order to identify the function of the behavior. How does the manipulation of events ensure the accuracy of the function of the behavior?
Well, each functional behavior can individually be tested to identify what is specifically causing behavior. So, for example, if we thought that attention could be the function of the behavior, then during that testing period, we would have just an adult in the room and nothing else with the child. And then each time the child engaged in the problem behavior, then the adult would provide the attention to identify if that truly is the function. And if not, then we can move on to different functions such as receiving a tangible and so on and so forth to identify which one is specifically causing the behavior.
Thank you. And then Jennifer, you mentioned that in an FA, there are numerous manipulated antecedents and consequences before. Do they prefer naturally, meaning they're occurring in a social setting?
So it's important with an FA to set up different scenarios for the manipulated antecedents to ensure that the behaviors are occurring as naturally as possible. Because the FAs unintentionally, we are reinforcing the undesired behavior, the consequences are drawn out for you ahead of time.
Perfect. And Cassandra, the article Evaluation of the Treatment Utility of the Analog Functional Analysis and the Structured Descriptive Assessment by Carrie L. English and Cynthia M. Anderson states that these assessments are typically conducted in more natural environments. Could you give an example of a natural environment versus a laboratory setting?
Sure. So, an example of a natural setting or a natural environment for this assessment could be somewhere where the behavior would most frequently occur. So, this could be a school or at home versus the more clinical setting.
Awesome. And then Jennifer, it was mentioned that once the observation period is complete, coaching will need to be provided for the family. If the family is being provided coaching, how will the BCBA ensure the intervention is being implemented correctly?
So the BCBA will be writing the intervention plan and teaching it to the team that will be providing the services. That team will need to be in the observation period and making sure that they are studying the behaviors as well. From there, the team providing the services will teach the parents and the client different skills that they can use. And the BCBA will ensure that the intervention is being presented correctly by continuing to provide supervision for the team in the home.
Thank you. And then Brittany, does the behavior determine if an FA or an FBA is more appropriate?
It kind of depends. To begin with, it depends on the type of resources that are available. So, for example, if there's a safe environment, you need to see if there's a safe environment in order to complete an FBA. And then there's also the possibility that an FBA doesn't see the severity of the behavior that is in question. Parents are seeing very aggressive behavior from a child. When the BCBA comes in to do an FBA observation, they may not see how severe the behavior is compared to what the parents are saying. So then using an FA would be more appropriate because you would be able to manipulate that behavior in order to get the severity and then go from there.
Perfect. So then Cassandra, weighing the risk and minimizing harm is important when doing a risk assessment. Would you care to share some of the safety precautions that are taken for client and staff?
Sure. So firstly, I think the assessment itself is a precaution, but then also determining the necessity of the FA is a big precaution they take. And also the BCBA practicing within their competency. So if they don't feel like they have the means to perform the risk assessment, then they shouldn't be going on with an FA anyways. Another precaution they take is getting proper consent from all parties. And then also ruling out any medical problems. So making sure that any aggression or anything goes through a doctor first to make sure there's not some underlying medical issue that could be causing it. And then also sometimes depending on what the FA is going to involve, there could potentially be medical examinations between each FA.
Thank you. So then as we are ending our presentation, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to comment on the post, and then we will answer accordingly.